high stakes testing can't even begin to produce accurate results, anyways, because the fact of the matter is that when it comes to high stakes testing, there's a law in sociology that, and it is really very much so a law in the sense that, when humans build systems like this is always the result. It's always the consequence. It's what people do when when a teacher, encounters a system, and this is just one example, when you have a metric that has, economic consequences basically for that result, and the higher the consequences and the higher the stakes happen to be, the more likely that the result of the systems will be gamed by people. And we know that these don't work in practice because teachers start teaching to the test, and to boost test scores because of the fact that the consequences of getting test scores up are so extreme that, and benefit their jobs so much that they start teaching for the test in order to try to scoop up more federal dollars because that's what's on the line. And the consequence of they've built a system of, if they fail over a long enough period of time, the school gets shut down, and if they succeed at everything, they get more federal money, right? But this backfires because teachers start teaching to the test and everything. They start teaching test questions directly in class, and then eventually, or they start teaching strategies, to do test and everything, and you have multiple choice questions and everything, which are broken in of themselves too, because with a multiple choice question it will be 4 possible outputs or 5, and 3 of them are obviously false. And even if you have no idea what the actual answer is to the question, you can just if you're able to eliminate 3 out of 5, you've got a 50-50 chance of getting the right answer anyways, if you just roll a dice at what answer you fucking put in and everything. And they start building these systems that are designed in such an asinine fashion, but they do it so that because of the scale of the people that are in it, that they can feed it to a machine that automatically scores people, because they don't want to have to go through the hassle of manual scoring. So they give you a fucking automated machine that is completely error prone and can't possibly produce accurate results, because the teachers teach the students all this. They start teaching them strategies like that, like, okay, if I can eliminate and cross off 3 of these questions out of 5, then I've still got a 50% chance of getting it, so just enter anything, instead of leaving the answer blank, and boom, you potentially got it right anyways. You've got a 50% chance, and you help the classroom out. If you do happen to score right, you help the whole school out get a better, result and everything, and we might get better funding if you do this. And they start teaching these kids how to game the system, and everything, and they start teaching them proficient strategies to fuck with the whole system. And so you've tied all these stakes to the test and everything, and you've tied all these outcomes and everything. And what Campbell's law states is basically, when the let me pull up the principle of the law, and this gets ignored all the time. Like, people know this, it's been raised in Campbell's law, and everything, but it's been ignored, and people seem to think that we can get around it or something, or it doesn't matter, or it isn't relevant. But if you think it's relevant, you're delusional. It is in fact so relevant that it is the highest of all priorities. It should be the first priority, and that matters infinitely more than everything else. And it's the only thing that matters, as if it's the only thing that's relevant, and everything else is of no weight whatsoever compared to it. We need to stop acting like it doesn't matter. Campbell's law posits that using high-stakes standard testing to measure educational quality leads to corruption of that metric and distortion in the educational process. As stakes like funding or job security rise, the focus shifts from learning to merely passing the test, causing reduced validity in assessment results and diminished student education. Coined by social scientist Donald T. Campbell, the law warns that inflating a quantitative indicator for social decision-making invites corruption of the indicator and the process by which it monitors. Curriculum distortion. The curriculum narrows, focusing only on tested subjects, while teaching to the test replaces holistic instruction. Cheating and misrepresentation end up, throughout the system. High pressure results in teachers and administrators cheating. They often go in and change the answers, even that the students give, to the right ones. student cheating, happens, improper exclusion of low performing students from tests. So they start, trying to weed, students that are not performing well out from the test so they don't get, they don't, it leads to gaming the system. And this is what happens, the system leads to declining teacher morale and creates an environment where students are viewed through the lens of test performance rather than learning. And validity concerns, high stakes testing undermines its own purpose. When tests are used to make critical decisions, they no longer accurately reflect the academic progress they are intended to measure. And the U.S. Department of Education itself knows this, and yet it's ignored all the fucking time. You don't have, the whole, of it. And, we, as high stakes testing has become, was an American school psychologist, a noted experimental social science researcher who did pioneering work on methodology and program evaluation. He has also become posthumously an unlikely hero of anti-testing and accountability movement in the United States. In the hand of accountability critics, his 50 years of research on methodology and program evaluation have been boiled down to a simple retort against testing, Campbell's Law. But a deeper reading of his work reveals a more complicated and constructive message. Measuring progress using both quantitative and qualitative indicators. It is essential. When using quantitative data for evaluation, the indicators become distorted or manipulated as there are concrete steps we can and must take to minimize data manipulation and distortion. So basically this is Campbell's Law. In his 1976 article, Assessing the Impact of Planned Social Change, has become a flashpoint in the educational accountability debate. There he argued, the more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision-making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures, and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social processes it is intended to monitor, right? And this is exactly what happens. Campbell's Law helps us understand why No Child Left Behind and the Race to the Top are harmful to education. As high-stakes testing has become the main driver of our nation's educational policy, we will see more cheating, more narrowing of the curriculum, and more gaming of the system. Ravitch explained, in response to an article posted here last week, Ravitch glibly said, Porter Magazine should Google Campbell's Law and study it. Similarly, several people took to Twitter to evoke Campbell's Law as a way of broadly dismissing the suggesting that standardized testing can and should have a role in school-level accountability. But, like all things, it's not quite that simple, as we're consuming the Fordham Institute's take on this. For starters, Campbell wasn't writing about testing in schools. He was writing about all the indicators that are used to inform social policy making, including schools, from ways we measure poverty in our cities to the indicators used to determine air quality to the reporting systems for assessing the level of discrimination in the workplace. He didn't set out to argue that there was anything about measurements in schools that posited any greater challenges when the measurement in any other complicated social endeavor. In fact, one of his key insights, I don't see why this is relevant though to the education debate. I mean, yeah, sure, it applies to more, than the school system. Sure, true, but it basically the results get corrupted. Campbell never argued that because numerical data was subject to manipulation or distortion, or because it's imperfect, we should abandon all hope of using this data to improve programs and systems. Indeed, his conclusion, Campbell goes out of his way to emphasize, the overall picture is not as gloomy as this seems, and many of the quasi-evaluations that I've scolded could have been implemented in better ways. Even more than that, Campbell encouraged us all to be wary of institutions and administrators whose impulse was to resist evaluation. Specifically, he noted, in the United States, one of the reasons why interruptible evaluators are so rare is in the widespread resistance of institutions and administrators to having programs evaluated in the first place. He argued that we needed to understand the reasons for this resistance and identify ways of overcoming it. Finally, and most importantly, Campbell argued that it was possible to protect against the, quote, harmful, unquote, impact of using data to drive decisions by identifying ways that we can uncover the distortion, corruption, and misuse of data and institutionalizing them. In education, for instance, he highlights two instances where independent external observers were able to identify and flag inappropriate behaviors that corrupted, student achievement data, one in Texarkana and one in Seattle. using multiple measures, basically one quantitative and one qualitative, so that the numerical data doesn't become the only way to judge a program's effectiveness or impact. At the same time, Campbell did warn specifically against using this kind of quantitative data to evaluate individuals, a useful caution for policymakers seeking to link test score data directly or systematically with teacher evaluation. What does this mean for education evaluation and test-based accountability? In a presentation delivered in 2010, Daniel Koretz, a Major author of Measuring Up, offered some helpful context and suggestion. Specifically, Koretz argues that a primary cause of Campbell's law is incomplete measurement of desired outcomes. And the way we've structured our testing accountability systems has set us up for failure. For starters, we have focused the lion's shares of our accountability on two subjects, reading and math. The schools that have focused on an ever-increasing number of hours on these subjects to the near exclusion of all else is a reasonable, if undesirable, response. If we value learning in other areas, we need to measure it, and that doesn't mean that adding testing hours, but rather being more deliberate and creative about the assessments we administer and the content that they measure. Campbell's warning suggests not that we abandon state-level standardized assessment, but accountability, but rather that we do a better job of protecting ourselves against this kind of manipulation and distortion. What's more, practically speaking, even in the particular content era, it would be near impossible to develop a test that measures everything students know and should be able to do. A standardized test, therefore, measures a sample of the total knowledge and skills problems arise. However, when high stakes are attached to test results, and when that sample becomes highly predictable, after all, if teachers know precisely what will be measured and that changes very little from year to year, they are far more likely to narrow the focus of their instructions on the knowledge skills that will be assessed, even at the expense of broader content that students should master to be prepared for what lies ahead. Thus, when tests become too predictable, teachers can effectively narrow their instruction to match the particular knowledge and skills that will appear on the test, or worse, they can coach students to game the test even without mastery of the content, basically, and I can do that already. I can teach you strategies about that. Like, for one thing, all you really need to know about this is if you encounter, like, for instance, if I go into here and I'm able, and I know the subject just well enough to know something like, okay, the y is like the 7, so it goes all the way down to 5. I already am able to eliminate, numbers that are not in there. So I check the graph is 5, -5 is in there, -7 is in there. There's a result at 3, there's a result at 4. So, there's a result all the way at 7. So, you already know like 5 and 5 is not in there. So, even though you can cross C off, you can cross 4 off, so you're able to eliminate a lot of these potential answers. Like, you may know that it's not B or C, for instance, on one of these questions, or, if you're able to eliminate answers that are obviously wrong, right? Then if you only are left with 2 possible answers, you can just roll a dice, or you can, I don't know, flip a coin basically to figure out which one of these, and assign heads or tails basically to A or D at that point, if you're able to do that. But I don't know that on this damn thing, so let me actually do the domain -5, and it goes all the way to 5. So that's what I would enter, but in a different context, if it wasn't C and that wasn't the right answer, if I was able to eliminate A and B, then I would have had to pick between C and D. And if I already know what the potential probability of getting, this is, and I think you probably do too, mathematically, which is a 50-50. It's a coin flip, so all you really need to do is flip a coin in terms of probability. And if you assign, like, for instance, you'd assign C to heads and D to tails. You flip the coin, and you've still got a 50% chance of getting it right on a test. You bring a coin with you to the test, and when you're able to limit it down to 3, and you may be able to I don't know. I mean, even for maybe you bring a four-sided dice, you can get those in gaming shops, or you can order one online for it. And what you do in the four-sided dice situation is that you just assign like, okay, so like basically if I am not able to, eliminate, or if I've got three potential things and I'm only able to eliminate one, and I've got a four-sided dice, then what I do is I assign, or maybe I get, an eight-sided one so that I can assign each number to two results, basically. So I say that, one and two, between one and two is A, between one and two is B. We really need a six-sided one in this scenario. So basically, what you do here is, with your little dice, and maybe you find a different way of sneaking it into the test, but or whatever. But what you do in this situation is that, you know, A is between one and two, B is between two and six. When you've got three potential answers, basically, and then at that point, you've got what, um, three and four would be B, and then you know uh, since there's no three-sided dice basically, and then C would be between five and six basically, and so you just roll it that way, and then you've got a 33% chance of getting it right, if you're only able to eliminate one answer in that scenario. It's a one in three chance that of getting it right under that scenario, so that's about 33% of a chance of getting it right under those scenarios. You can learn to game these systems to just to brute force your way through and everything in a way that's just outright cheating on it, and you've still got a pretty good solid chance of breaking through even if you haven't mastered the material at all under that scenario. And so what really gets undermined in these processes is, now I had to do these the right way. I had to learn the subjects and actually do it, so that I was able to produce the right answer. So I have actually not cheated at this. I haven't actually rolled the dice to get my 100% proficiency, because I'd only be cheating myself under this system. But when there's a high stakes system, right, when my school is on the line and when funding is completely on the line in scenarios like that, if you have a good test taker that usually gets the answer right but may run into questions that they don't know the answer to or haven't mastered, like I said, there's a 50, if you're able to eliminate two out of the four questions, if you roll the dice, you've still got a 50-50 shot at the last two answers of getting it right. If you're only able to eliminate one, that's a 33% chance of getting it right no matter what you enter. And you can start filling in the gaps in that manner on high stakes testing, and that starts to undermine the system. You start to be able to coach them to do it and everything. Like, I'm coaching you, dear subscriber, to do it, and a lot of this is deliberate sabotage on my part. I'm doing it to fuck the system up, to fuck accountability metrics up, just to force their hands, to to abandon hope of evaluating valid results in this system. I want to undermine it. I'm intentionally being subversive, and everything. And Campbell's law is basically something every educator should know. Which is just to say that as soon as I learned Campbell's law, how I conceived my teaching changed. One concept I wish everyone concerned about education were familiar with is Campbell's law. I certainly wish I knew about it 20 or more years ago. Campbell's law states that the more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures and more apt it will be to corrupt the social process that it is intended to monitor. Campbell's law was coined by Donald Campbell, a social scientist, using figure of research methodology. Campbell's law is the best understood with an example. Imagine researchers observed that the happiest couples kissed each other goodbye in the morning, and that we were told that the key to a lasting partnership is to peck before partying. Sorry. While this is an undeniably nice thing, it's easy to see that this peck is not motivated by underlying feelings of love and affection. It does not carry much meaning. If the peck is the point, it becomes meaningless as an indicator of happiness. Campbell's theory was drawn directly from observations of schools and teaching. He noted that achievement tests can be useful indicators of what students are learning, provided they are preceded by normal teaching aimed at general competence. Once scoring well on the test becomes the point, those tests lose their value as predictors of competence. So teachers not only teach these students to get the right results, but we have seen examples of corruption inside the system. Even we've seen teachers go back in and check the students' results before the submitting to the state and correcting the errors. They may replicate them onto a new sheet if they have to and everything, and reassign it once again to the thing. They may even be instructed by the front office to do it, because of the fact that gaming the system and fucking it up is basically how they get better they get better results at everything. The state gives them better money if they boost the scores. Tutoring and preparation for tests like the SAT, such as what Educational Endeavors offers, are only partly oriented around improving general competence in content areas like reading or algebra, because in order to score as highly as possible, it is just as or more important to understand how the testing mechanism works. Yet insider knowledge of what logic test writers follow and what traps they lay ultimately does not translate to anything beyond taking the SAT. With test prep tutoring, at least the bargain is clear. We're preparing students for a discrete event with potentially high stakes, where knowledge of the SAT itself, not just grammar and geometry, is what's vital. However, while the skills learned through that test prep may have benefits in terms of improving focus, executive function, and personal drive, the resulting SAT score is not a strong indicator of how much someone has learned from school or how likely they are to do in college. This is not just because of Campbell's law, and it's all not because just because of not just because financial resources often dictate how much test prep a student will receive, but also because the SAT is a single event that cannot measure potential or quantify the many variables necessary for academic success. There's little doubt that we can do better when it comes to the metric for college preparation, which is why I'm personally pleased to see the trend towards eliminating its use. The SAT is a relatively benign compared to what happens when schools or states get in the vicious circle of testing and so-called accountability that's driven by Campbell's law. The results are damaging and distorting the classroom practices. I've seen it in generations of writing centered around training students to pass assessments by writing 5-paragraph essays utilizing approaches that are they're in reality counterproductive to actually learning how to write. This is not the fault of teachers or students, but of a system that has mistaken a single indicator for a complex set of skills and knowledge. I see this also in schools that drill behaviors like sitting straight and tracking of the speaker because they view those traits as indicators of paying attention, but surface level indicators of attention are not synonymous with engagement and are definitely not always an indicator of learning. A classroom that looks to be working with military precision may be satisfying as a snapshot for the purposes of surface level accountability, but it may also be sacrificing learning for the appearance of order. I had this problem with some of my teachers too. You know, uh, Basically, my teacher would monitor me to look for signs that I was looking at her and making eye contact and all that other stuff with her, or trying to track her movements in the classroom and looking at her directly, and everything to see if I was engaged in paying attention to her. And because I wasn't, she concluded I wasn't paying attention to her. But this was completely errant. It was not the case. It was like just it was a psychotically delusional conclusion on her part that was not supported by the weight of the evidence. It was just her intuition about whether I was paying attention based on the indicators that she was able to see at the time. But I have my teacher's notes from back then in the day where she basically concluded I wasn't paying attention because I was glancing elsewhere in the classroom. But I don't need to be looking directly at somebody to be observing what they're saying, and if they're not putting anything on the blackboard basically and they're just talking and about a subject, I don't need to be looking directly at them to understand what's going on if it's not on the projector, and everything. So I can look elsewhere and still track the conversation. I don't need to be looking directly at you to be paying attention to what you're saying. You know, just it's not as if I have to track the movement of your lips in order to understand what you're saying. I don't have to read lips to understand what people are saying. Demanding attention when it hasn't been earned can also degrade the quality of teaching and instruction. The best thing I ever did for the quality of my college writing classes was to end mandatory attendance. I'm now under the pressure of delivering experiences and instructions that students believed were worthwhile and related to their own learning. The dynamic required both me and students to increase the rigor and discipline of our work. Campbell's Law shows up a lot in the real world and has genuinely bad effects. Any company that relentlessly sends you a survey after completing a service or purchase is likely in the throes of dedication to something called the Net Promoter Score (NPS). When employees are subject or either reward or punishment for not keeping the NPS above a certain threshold, distortions may result. I recently received an evaluation that said I didn't give all tens on the survey. They'd be following up with a call to see what they could do better next time. Rather than giving tens, I ignored the survey. Either way, the company's data is corrupted, either by non-responses or by conversion to give all tens. Basically, yeah. I mean, they don't get accurate results. It said if I didn't give tens on it, they'd be following up with a call. Basically, once you start looking to Campbell's Law in the world, you notice it often. When you do, and it's impacting you, you take a step back and ask yourself why. What is truly meaningful about what you're trying to achieve, and then what kind of evidence would reflect what is meaningful. You know, so basically the power to test is the power to shape the curriculum, and maybe that's useful sometimes and damaging in others. Basically an application of correlation does not prove causality. Exactly. And then what's so incredibly frustrating is that, about NPS, and so another person, Amy, about NPS and standardized testing, is that some level leaders seem to realize that they have become horse hockey in terms of actually measuring anything worthwhile, but don't have the courage or power to pull the plug on the whole operation. I had an extra executive once who was convinced we were providing poor service and totally blow off our high NPS. We may have been, but to resolve the issues, we would have had to totally reconsider what we were doing and maybe stop doing it. Once an organization, business, or school gets so large that it cannot tell if its customers are happy or receiving a good product or service, that it's probably a sign it has needed to be broken up or at least strongly decentralized. There's definitely the sunk cost fallacy. Basically combined with the resignation that you have to do something if it's at all dubious. So this is the best we can do. That's wrong, of course, but as you know, it requires a genuine and deep reconsideration around the things the organization actually values. And this is incredible. This whole problem and everything, and it is actively ignored. Campbell's Law, and the thing is that this always plays out in practice. It always happens because you can't just expect somebody to willingly lose their job. We've created a system where the stakes are so high and brutally high that if a school doesn't boost scores over a long enough period, the school gets shut down. And if the school does boost scores, then it gets better funding and everything. And so these metrics always get gamed reliably because it is, Campbell's Law teaches us that it's human nature to game systems when, the outcomes of those systems benefit you or harm you. And especially if they both if they basically hold a gun to your head on one end and basically dangle a carrot on the other, that the higher the stakes end up being when it's tied to a reward, it ends, and the higher the stakes end up being because it's tied to both a gun and a negative consequence and a positive one on the other. The more that it's like that, the more likely people are going to fucking try to find ways to fuck with it. And we have seen results like that in the system. There have been examples of teachers that cheat, or, that alter the students' papers and everything just to get higher scores, that cover up bad scores and everything. We've seen just complete fuckery to sabotage the results, and here I am too, teaching you how to fuck with the system with a pair of dice.